Awesome. 2 times in 2 days. It's a record. So this is a little bit of old news. I wanted to cover this. I think I mentioned it a couple months ago, but there has been a movement going on for about 15 years across the United States to get circumcision removed from Medicaid funding. The logic of this seems pretty simple. Medicaid funding is kind of designed for people who are poor, who can't afford, medical care, but there are stipulations within it that it can't be used for cosmetic things. You can't go there to get a boob job or to get a plastic surgery or anything that's elective. So it's one thing if you need heart surgery or you need cancer treatment or you need antibiotics because you have a horrible infection. It's another thing to say, that you want to get Botox or, uh, you know, uh, 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 a labiaplasty or something like that. And interestingly enough, circumcision is cosmetic. It's almost never done for medical reasons. There are certain medical reasons that it could be used for if you did have congenital phimosis, which um, does happen. It's questionable how much of a problem it actually is. I know people who have phimosis as adults who are fine, that they don't see it as a problem, and it typically can be fixed without circumcision if you do think it's a problem. But the vast majority of circumcisions are not done because there's any kind of medical indication. You have a healthy child who does not need anything done, and it's done. It's even billed in Medicaid as cosmetic. And so there's people who, I mean, to be fair, you could look at that and say, just as someone who's maybe against fraud or for budgetary reasons, say, uh, this is wrong. You shouldn't be billing something that's cosmetic and just say it's necessary. Um, and but I think that's also true though that the people who are pushing this are doing it because they actually just think circumcision is wrong. I agree with that, by the way. I think circumcision is wrong. You shouldn't do it to minors unless it's medically necessary. Again, not to say that there are medical benefits, which is kind of an illusory metric to be using, but uh, it's not medically necessary though. Just because you can find I mean, any body part that you remove, once you've removed it, then any potential problems with that body part are also removed, right? Any part that you remove, that part's never going to get infected. That part's never going to have cancer. And so you could then say, well, that's a medical benefit, but that's not the the standard that could be used or should be used. So there's been this movement to basically get it removed from Medicaid coverage, and it's been successful. There's already been 17 states where this has happened, and these removals of the bans do not ban the procedure. The procedure is still legal. People can still pay to get it done. People still do get it done. There's nobody stopping them. I think it is fair to say, and I'll put my cards on the table here, that I think it actually should be banned. And I think a lot of people who support this legislation also think it should be banned. But that doesn't mean that they're wrong or that their arguments against it being publicly financed are wrong. So I got to see a bit of this process a little bit up close and personal because New Hampshire has been kind of one of the states where this is attempted to be passed. That was attempted to be passed last year at the start of 2024, failed to pass the House. It was brought up again this year. The Speaker of the House, who is a Free Stater, supports the bill. In this iteration this year, it is called HB 94. I actually got to go to the public hearings for the House subcommittee. All right, so you have that the House and the Senate, and then they each have subcommittees that deal with relevant legislation. Those hearings are very long, but they're open to the public. You can just kind of show up and go watch if you want. If it's not a topic you're interested in, it'd be incredibly boring, but you certainly could. I was alerted that this was going on. I took a little time off work. I went to the House hearing. Uh, it is interesting to kind of watch that process in general because uh, the public is allowed to speak, but under very constrained circumstances. They were giving people, I think, 3 to 5 minutes. I can't remember exactly. I think it was 3 minutes to speak. And unless there was a follow-up question from a committee member, they couldn't elaborate more. And so the people on the committee who are elected representatives are given free rein to talk as much as they want, to ask as many questions as they want, to bring people back and to interrogate them as much as they want. The people of the public, no matter their degree of expertise or lack of expertise, can. And I understand practically that makes sense. You don't want to just say, hey, let people go as long as they want, but to try and encapsulate points that quickly, I mean, it is kind of silly, and I will say, kind of nerve-wracking when you speak. I think it's not as easy as people make it sound. But regardless, when I attended, it was interesting because there wasn't really any debate about its medical necessary. Nobody's denying that it's not medically necessary, at least in the vast majority of cases. And I would argue, for infants in particular, it's almost never justified because you cannot you cannot even diagnose phimosis in an infant. So for those of you who don't know, and I think most of you probably do, phimosis is when you have a foreskin that's opening is sufficiently small or inelastic, it could be some combination of the two, that it cannot retract below the head or be pulled back behind the head, behind. Um, and that is something that isn't necessarily a problem. And I know people who are adults who have phimosis and are fine. I know people who are in their 30s who have never retracted their foreskins once in their entire lives, and they're fine. Other people have more problems with it. It can be something that can be a problem. It certainly can be a problem psychologically. It can be a physical problem too. It is possible that it could be uncomfortable. It is possible that it could raise hygiene issues, but it just kind of depends. I mean, people's physiology is different. People's lifestyles are different, and there are people who it's not a big deal. But the thing to know is that uh, when babies are born, they almost never can retract their foreskins. They're fused. There's a membrane very similar to the membrane that you find between your fingernail and your finger that fuses or attaches the foreskin to the head of the penis. This is to help keep it clean, and then uh, that membrane will slowly dissolve or work off over time, and at some point retraction will become possible. But it's actually a very wide window. I think it's something like the median age, as in the age when half of an age cohort will be able to retract, is like 10. So if you look at 10-year-olds, about 50% of them should be able to fully retract, but about 50% of them will not be able to retract at that point. And so some people will retract at 5, some people will retract at 15. And it's not until you get to there's a very small number, I think it's 1 to 2% that can retract at birth. So it's very rare, but it does happen. And then there's about 1 to 2% who can't retract even when they're 18. It's that group that you could then start to say maybe circumcision is an option. It wouldn't even be necessary in that case, but it's something that could be an option. They might actually have phimosis. Looking at a newborn baby or a 1-year-old or a 5-year-old or even a 10-year-old and saying, oh, they can't retract, they must have phimosis, is totally wrong. That's just outdated in the extreme in terms of medical understanding. But one of the things about this issue is that there is a consistent cultural bias and even a specific medical cultural bias against foreskin where it's not understood or it's even uh, stigmatized. And I was just having this conversation. There's a guy at my gym who is from Quebec and he's uncircumcised and he's in his 30s and he said he gets a physical every periodically and the physician at every single time says he should get circumcised even though he has no problems. He's never had a problem. There's nothing wrong. Everything's fully functional, but in the mind of his physician, he just should be circumcised, period. Like just having a foreskin is a problem, even if it's not a problem. If he doesn't have phimosis, doesn't have pain, he doesn't have anything. Um, but there's a certain tendency, I don't know, it's hard not to psychologize it, and maybe that's not a good idea just because there maybe are different reasons people feel that way. There could be people who genuinely feel that circumcision is just medically better. There are people who might have personal reasons. There might be people who think that's just the best practice, or it could be a joke, who knows? But the point is, you can't look at a newborn or a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old and say, oh, they have phimosis, they need circumcision. That is just not medically possible unless there's some, I don't know, maybe some type of balanitis or something where you can tell that there's something in addition wrong, but the inability to retract is not that. And what's interesting in the hearings is nobody is debating that. Nobody is coming out and saying, we absolutely need this because these kids are going to die. Uh, there was a lot of ambiguity about the numbers involved. So New Hampshire's not a huge state. I think the population is something like 1.6 million. It's a wealthy state, so the number of people on Medicaid is low. There are people on Medicaid. The state is spending money on this, but it's not a lot of money. Uh, and I just found out by watching the Senate hearings on this, it sounds like the reimbursement is only something like 50 or 60 bucks. Now the operation itself costs more than that, but they were saying things like the state was paying $100,000 a year, something like that. So it's a trivial. Like the state budget is $16 billion for 2 years. They basically do 2-year budgets. So for state budgets, that's pretty small, but that's a big amount for New Hampshire. And of course, 100,000, 300,000, even a million out of that budget is not a big chunk. Um, but it wasn't clear, and this could not even be established in the hearings, how many babies are getting circumcised with Medicaid money every year. The number is not zero. They're spending money on it. If it is $100,000 and they're only spending $50 per baby, that would imply that that there's my math is going to be 20,000. Is that what it would be? 20,000 babies? That seems like a lot, but maybe not. Let me. Wow, my math shouldn't be this bad. 2,000. That sounds more reasonable. I just carried the zero wrong. So that sounds. I don't know how many babies are born per year in New Hampshire. So like, what? How many babies? How many babies are born each year? Oh, okay. So, okay, this makes more sense. So, roughly 12,000 babies are born in New Hampshire each year. And how many baby boys? I assume that's 6,000. Yeah, 6,000. It is roughly 50-50 split. That's what you would expect. So, I mean, again, this is one thing, even watching both of these hearings, it just never got super clear how many boys are getting circumcised with this money. If the $50 per procedure is correct and the $100,000 is also correct, that would imply that it's 2,000 a year, or roughly a third of the boys who are born every year. That doesn't mean the other third, 2/3 are not getting circumcised. It just means they're not getting circumcised with Medicaid. But I really don't have much confidence in these numbers. That's one thing that listening to the hearings, they have a rough idea what the state is spending. They don't have a breakdown on how often it's being spent, like how many individual boys are involved in this. So then the other thing that just kind of kept coming up is you had a lot of people coming up, Jewish people particularly, and saying, "Hey, this is anti-Semitic. This is important Jews." Interestingly enough, everyone I saw who spoke in favor of it as a Jew was a woman. There were no male Jews who spoke about it, which is kind of weird. There were Jews also who spoke against it. I mean, one thing. Uh, if you read intactivist literature, if you look into the organizations that are trying to stop circumcision, they're full of Jews. I mean, there's a lot of Jews have been leaders in this field. And it wouldn't surprise me if the circumcision rate among especially secular Jews in the US is actually lower than the average rate because there's so many who are so progressive when it comes to things like this that they are just opting to not have it done. So like there are uncircumcised Jews other than there's lots of Jews who are against circumcision. It was interesting in both hearings that no male Jews spoke against it or against the bill, but some female Jews did. But also female Jews spoke for the bill. I don't know if any male Jews spoke for the bill. Um, but this idea that, well, this is a religious mandate for Jews, it's very, very important. That's true. It is a religious mandate for Jews. It's quite explicit. Of course, religion being what it is and Jews being what they are, there's certainly some who look at it and find ways around it or explain it another way, and that's very common. But what's interesting is like Medicaid doesn't reimburse medical doesn't reimburse religious ceremonies. A moil, who is the religious figure who performs circumcision in a Jewish ceremony, um, does not um, get reimbursed from Medicaid. They aren't. Oh, and the thing is, religious, like ceremonial circumcision, it's not done in a hospital. It's usually done in someone's home. There's moils, there's rabbis, it's like a party, there's a chair, and it's a whole ceremony. And it's not just, you don't just get circumcised and that's it. There's a whole ceremony around it. And if you don't have that, it's not a religious circumcision. And there's actually been litigation about this where a Jewish family, of course, wanted their son to be circumcised, a religious family. He was born in a hospital, and then the hospital just circumcised him. And they were furious because they didn't want it done in a hospital by just some surgeon. They wanted it done in the ceremony. Now, they can't do the ceremony because it was done in the hospital. And this actually led to a lawsuit, and it led to hospitals getting a little bit more affirming, where they actually try and get positive consent that they're going to do this. They'll push it on people. I think it probably still just does happen sometimes, but I think it's become harder. There was a time when they were just doing them. There are cases of people saying we don't want it done, telling the doctors they don't want it done, and there's such a conveyor belt that it just happens anyway. That is probably harder now because of this incident with this Jewish family. But the point is, Medicaid doesn't subsidize that. You can't go and say, oh, here's your money to, and it's just such a strange idea of this number of boys who are getting it, who are Medicaid. So you're talking about in New Hampshire, poor families that are on Medicaid and are also Jewish, and this is the most important right of their thing. And there are anthropologists, there are people who have, they analyze all the things that are associated with Judaism, whether it's the clothing or the kosher, or the synagogue or the temple or whatnot, and they have kind of concluded like the strongest single trait, the most common single trait, the most universal trait is the circumcision thing. That other things might vary, whether they wear the funny hat or not, or if they're that stuff can vary. But the circumcision thing doesn't really vary much, at least within the religious community, so far as it goes. Um, and so for that reason, is you think this is something that they can't really. I mean, it's very important to them, but then what they can't pay for themselves, like if it's so important to their community, this is something they can't find money. They can't find moils who will do it for free. They can't find Jewish doctors who will do it for free or do it for cheap or whatever. Again, we're not talking about banning. I think it should be banned, but that's not what this legislation is about. So this does pass the committee in the House. This then passes the House. I think it was a close vote, but it passed nonetheless. Actually, it may have passed by like 20 votes. I'd have to look. That was last fall or late in the year. I think it was in maybe December, maybe November. It just started to snow, and then a few weeks ago it was debated in the Senate, and in the Senate subcommittee, uh, again, there was the people who spoke against the bill tended to be Jewish women and doctors who had committed circumcisions and had, frankly, ridiculous ideas about. So, troping out that it's a vestigial, that it has no purpose, that it's from caveman days. Uh, Interestingly enough, one of the doctors who was speaking against the bill said, I've done circumcisions before, and it's much cheaper to do them into babies because if you do them when they're 3 or 4, you have to give them anesthetic. And it's just kind of throwaway line, but then it's also confirming something that people will argue and then other people will deny. But like, so the implication of that is that you don't give anesthesia to babies. Now, there's good reasons they don't give anesthesia to neonates. It's very dangerous, right? Their systems are not really robust enough for something like that, and they can die. So you're giving surgery. You're crushing and cutting off part of the penis, and there's not even anesthesia involved. And they'll say, oh, you won't remember it. And like, yeah, because these are all things that would justify not just circumcision, they would justify rape, they would justify all kinds of things that the baby is not going to remember when it gets older. But this idea that this is anti-Semitic, and there are even people like, well, in this day and age, when anti-Semitism is on the rise by 1,000,000% because the ADL says, everyone who protests what's happening in Gaza is an anti-Semite, and anyone who questions Bibi Netanyahu or Israel is an anti-Semite in any degree. Yes, I mean, yeah, there's a rise in I mean, there probably is a true rise of anti-Semitism, right? When stuff like when you have a state that identifies itself with the Jewish people and just claims to speak on their behalf and to represent them and to be them and to embody them, and then it does something really fucked up like commit a genocide or an ethnic cleansing or whatever you want to call what they're doing to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza for that matter, there's probably going to be a rise of anti-Semitism for sure. There's also just going to be a rise of people opposing that, and there's a certain class of people in the U.S. and who just reflexively will say everything that's a criticism of Israel, anything that's a criticism of what they do or how they do it is anti-Semitic. And you could see that this argument had a lot of cachet with the senators involved. One of them basically just came and said, I think we should table this because I saw a movie where the Germans just told people to drop their pants to see if they were circumcised or not and then would kill them if they were Jewish. Um, Kind of curious what movie that was. It sounds like he's making that up, but yeah. So we can't. And the idea though that these bans for Medicaid go back at this point more than 20 years. I think we've had it taken off in Florida, off in California, right? California famously anti-Semitic. Oregon, Washington also famously anti-Semitic. Everyone knows Florida is super anti-Semitic. I mean, they just hate Jews in Florida, obviously. But the idea that, oh, it's anti-Semitic now because of the post October 7th world is just totally asinine because people have been trying to get this removed from Medicaid for 30, 40 years. I think, though, what is really happening is that I think there's an understanding that this isn't just about Medicaid, that what's likely going to happen when they remove it from Medicaid, the rates of circumcision typically do go down. Sometimes they go down a lot. Doesn't mean people who want them will still get them, but then a lot of people who are on the margin won't. And then you have a problem because in 20 or 30 years after that, a large majority of the population is likely to then be uncircumcised. And once that happens, then things like bans become feasible. It's not really conceivable to have a ban when 70% of the men are circumcised. It's also interesting. He's saying, well, people always say the senator said something. He was like, we never want that to happen again, and so I'm not going to let there be a ban. But if the point of that was that you have an identifying mark that makes it easy to persecute a minority, then perpetuating that identifying mark is not a good idea. The way to do that would to be abolish that identifying mark. So if everybody was uncircumcised, I mean, you either then force everyone to be circumcised, or you have everyone be not circumcised, and then it wouldn't matter. People wouldn't know, right? We're at this point where I think a lot of people will say, hey, if you're circumcised, I mean, in the United States, if you are operating on the assumption only Jewish people are circumcised, you'd just be wrong so much of the time that it wouldn't be useful because there's way too many Gentiles who are circumcised. And this also probably was true in places like the Soviet Union. I mean, that's a situation where you did have an occupying force that was going to execute people because they were Jewish and would be crass enough to maybe check their dicks. But in the Soviet Union, a lot of Jews were not circumcised. Some of them because of the war. I mean, I've even seen an interview with a guy who had said, he was born in 44, and there was a very strong, I mean, his family was Jewish, and they were like, we normally would want him circumcised, but we're not going to have it done in this environment. This is maybe not the time or the place. Um, and so the logic here doesn't really make a lot of sense. What are you saying? We want to keep Jews and Gentiles different. It's also interesting too that they are often would say, well, Jews and Muslims. Of course, the religious proclivity of Muslims to want to circumcise their daughters, which is very strongly there, suddenly their religious freedom means nothing, right? So your religious freedom for circumcision for males is so strong that the state should subsidize it, right? I mean, I wonder if these same people would favor bar mitzvahs being paid for. But if you believe you want to circumcise your daughter in any degree, even the most minor degree, a degree that is far less invasive and more minor than male circumcision, which some female forms of circumcision are indeed that. They're very mild indeed, some of them. Some of them are more extreme and some of them are more mild. Um, they don't care how religiously certain you are that that's the right thing or how much you can validate that's from your culture. They're going to say, no, that's a felony. It's totally prescribed, and it is prescribed in the United States. Again, female circumcision confuses some people because there's a wider range of how it's done, right? There's forms of female circumcision that are a lot more extreme than standard male circumcision, although there are outliers even within male circumcision, where you basically remove all the external genitals and then you infibulate, and then you could say, oh, and you're doing it uh, without anesthetic, although they don't do with anesthetic for babies for male circumcision either, with, rusty knives in a dung hut, and it's super risky. Yeah, that's true. Uh, but there's also types of male circumcision that are likewise far, far worse, where they're not done in a hospital. They're usually not done with anesthetic, even when they are done in hospitals, that involve um, super unsanitary things like using your fingernail to peel the skin off and using your lips to suck the blood out to cleanse it. Right? This is not that rare among certain Hasidic communities of Jews, and there's been cases of Jewish men giving, herpes and other STDs to newborn babies by doing this. And, it's not great to get herpes when you're sexually active as an adult. It's actually quite dangerous to happen if you're a neonate. And there have been cases of babies dying and getting brain damage because of this. And so we don't, it's interesting, the advocates of circumcision never judge circumcision by that. They judge it by the cleanest form of the operation, but then when it comes to female circumcision, no, we're only going to talk about the rusty knives and sub-Saharan dung huts, but we're not going to talk about, you know, Muslim physicians who have medical degrees from, Ivy League universities doing ceremonial pinpricks that leave no scar and remove no tissue, but just produce a ceremonial drop of blood, and they're going to pretend like, because that is, I mean, people have brought suit on that specific issue, that specific form of female circumcision, and the the overwhelming consensus in the judiciary and the bioethicists is like, that's still wrong. That's still horrible, even though that's nothing. You can't even determine that the procedure was done a week later. Like a gynecologist could look and be like, I don't know that this girl circumcised. I mean, if it's just a pinprick, that's nothing. So, uh, and even the WHO, I mean, the WHO I think has like 4 to 6 different types of female circumcision that it goes to in severity, but all of them are considered wrong because they're not necessary. Now, Ben Shapiro, in his great wisdom, would say that, male circumcision isn't harmful because he's got 4 kids and you can still reproduce, and that may be true, but that you can reproduce, but circumcised women can reproduce as well. I mean, the birth rate in Egypt is higher than the birth rate in Israel, and they both circumcise their boys, but I guess there's an added fertility bonus if you circumcise your girls because the birth rate in Egypt is higher. And Egypt's a good one because they otherwise they touch their same climate and whatnot. Um, but suddenly, oh, no, we're going to switch logics now, and the idea that, well, it's not harmful because you can procreate doesn't apply to female circumcision, even though females who are circumcised typically can reproduce quite easily, actually. And they also, if it's done to them as a child, they're not going to grow up missing the part of their body that's not there. I mean, it's literally not there, but psychologically, they're like, oh, I really miss my labia or my clitoral hood or my clitoris, depending on what was removed. Whatever, even if it reduces sensitivity 99%, well, the 1% that's left feels like everything. That feels like all that there is, right? And so, and the same is true with male circumcision. And there's lots of debates about this. I don't think that we can get a definitive answer. I actually don't think that there is a definitive answer in the sense that I don't think all foreskins and all glands are created the same de novo, right? Having experienced them, not every uncut guy is exactly the same sensitivity as every other uncut guy, nor is every cut guy the same sensitivity as every other cut guy. But there's a bell curve, and the tail of the one, I don't know the terms here, right? But like, yes, the least sensitive uncut guys are less sensitive than the most sensitive cut guys, but the averages are not even close. Uh, and whatever it really wouldn't matter how much it's reduced. If it's reduced when you're a neonate and you have no memory, then whatever is left is going to feel normal to you, and you're not gonna miss the things that you never felt unless you think about it or you start to. And this is what does happen with a lot of people. They start to realize probably I am missing something, and some people maybe have issues that they then attribute to that. And maybe sometimes they're attributing things falsely and sometimes not falsely, but it just seems like a stretch to say, oh no, there's no way it could be anything. So, um, a huge tangent there, but it just rings hollow when people say, oh, they want to stand on this religious freedom card and say we can't stop subsidizing circumcision for that tiny number of Jewish kids who are poor in New Hampshire and really, really, really want to get circumcised really bad, but they also don't want to spend any money on it. Um, but then, yeah, fuck you if you're Muslim and you want to circumcise your daughter. No, that's that. If you try that, we're going to actually throw you in prison. It's we're not going to not only not going to subsidize you, we're going to throw you in prison if you do it to a girl, unless they're transsexual, and then you could say, oh no, it's fine. So. Uh, it rings so they didn't even vote on it. They just said we're just going to table this and we're not even going to talk about it right now. Now that doesn't mean that it's over. This is likely going to come up again and again and again. They can tell themselves that it's anti-Semitic as long as they want. That's simply not the case. It's not anti-Semitic to say that it's not anti-Semitic to say that the state shouldn't subsidize it. It's even less anti-Semitic to say maybe Jews shouldn't be mutilating, their penises. It doesn't make sense from the point of view of uh, we want Jews to blend in, so therefore we should allow them to do a procedure that will make it easy to identify them relative to everybody else. That doesn't make sense. Um, I do wonder how many Jews were saved because they weren't circumcised. Probably more than a few. Um, Monaco. It wouldn't have done any good if you've been captured by Menachem Begum in 1946 and you were an uncircumcised Jew, you probably were in some serious trouble. Um, let's see. So if you want, I mean, you can actually go and watch the hearing. One good thing about New Hampshire is they do record everything, and it's all up on YouTube for you to see if you want to see it. It's also interesting to see how many of the council people are just on their phones, like texting random people the whole time. Um, but they basically said, hey, this is anti-Semitic, ignoring the fact that this has been happening all over the country for several decades now. It has nothing to do with October 7th. The bill doesn't target any groups. Their grandstanding about religion rings totally hollow because they would not support female circumcision, no matter how much Muslims say that it's justified by their religion. Um, and the one what was her name? Miriam. Oh, let me get this right. Oh yeah. So Senator Rosenwald spoke against the bill. She's in the Senate, but she's not on the subcommittee, and she just admitted, like, I don't know anything about um, the medicine, and I don't know anything about religion. Um, so, okay, great. You're admitting you don't know anything about these things, but she just said it's really important. And she quoted one verse in Genesis, saying, God, mark your flesh. What's interesting is within the Old Testament, circumcision I think is mentioned 4 times, and 2 times it's as a covenant for God, and 2 times, so half, it's a punishment done to prisoners, right? Like the Israelites would defeat an army of whoever, right? The Moabites or right, whoever Canaanite uh, peoples they were trying to subjugate uh, defensively after well, anyway, and then circumcise the men as a punishment or as a way to count how many. Oh, we'll just count the foreskins. You can just head count. It wouldn't be easier just to count someone and then, but rather than whatever. It's also pretty clear. Again, anthropologists are quite satisfied that circumcision probably began as a stand-in for child sacrifice. Now, Canaanites are kind of notorious for doing child sacrifice. If you've ever heard anything about Bohemian Grove and Moloch and Alex Jones, you maybe have heard about that, but actually that controversy goes way, 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 way back. Because even the Romans in the Punic Wars were accusing the Carthaginians, and Carthage is obviously in Tunisia, but it was founded by, I believe, by Byblos. It was Canaanite. It was like the Phoenicians from Canaan founded Carthage, and scholars do believe that child sacrifice was actually done in Carthage, and that some Canaanites did actually practice child sacrifice, and that at least in the Canaanite context, we don't know about the Egyptian context. The Egyptian context, the first references to circumcision do go to ancient Egypt. It wasn't done as a prophylactic, certainly. It was done as a status marker to certain priestly castes, but not to everyone. Uh, it does seem in the Bible, there's a scene in the desert. I'm going to get this wrong, but an angel appears before Moses' wife, and she's with an infant child of Moses, and basically demands the child. And she thinks on her feet and she quickly circumcises the baby and gives the angel the foreskin instead. Like, okay, this is good enough, right? And the angel's, yeah, that'll do it. That's not the sole basis of the idea, but it does seem like it was a more mild form of child sacrifice. Um, Still a risky one. I mean, it's still risky today with modern medicine. There's all kinds of complications. Death does happen, although it must be admitted that is rare as far as we know. There's some evidence that it may actually kill more people than we think because there's some evidence that it correlates with SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So this is not conclusively known, and I'm not saying this is totally true, but apparently there is a correlation that it's much more common among boys, but only more common among boys who are circumcised. So boys who are not circumcised, it's less common. There's other things too. There's a lot of stuff when you do stuff to infants, they don't really report on anything. Right. So when they say, oh, complication rate's low, they could give you the most botched circumcision ever, and you're not going to complain about it. You're not even going to know. And when you grow up and you start to have your, I don't know, first comparative experiences, let's call it that, where you see your friends naked, they see you naked, you're you're probably not going to know what's different. If you have a skin bridge, I mean, I've met people with skin bridges and they don't know what they are. They don't know why they have them. These are adults. Adults with skin bridges do not know why they have them, and those are very common side effects. I don't think there's even any other causes of circumcision unless you were like in a car accident, but then they would know that. So, uh, and there's other things too. Like there was a famous study in Canada where they were noticing that uh, baby boys were much less pain tolerant because when they would vaccinate them, they would scream and cry way more than girls. And they're like, wow, maybe boys are just more sensitive and they're less pain tolerant. And so they decided to study it, and it turned out it wasn't boys, it was just circumcised boys. So the boys who were uncircumcised, they had the same rate of crying as girls did, but the ones who were circumcised had a much higher rate. So their threshold of pain tolerance went way, way down. If you imagine that, so then every pain stimulus that they would be submitted to for at least a year, maybe more, is going to be worse than it otherwise would. But they're never going to know that, like, they're not going to complain. That's not going to be listed. So, when we talk about the risks of complications and whatnot, any estimate you're going to give is going to be just a minimal one because the reporting is but necessarily going to be very, very difficult. The parents aren't going to scrutinize the penis. They're not going to be able to see it's too small, right? It's too there's so much you're looking at an infant, so you just can't say, oh, well, you can't judge it the same way you maybe could have judged an adult, and you're not going to see an adult, so. Um, it's really, really, and even the American Academy of Pediatrics, when they came up with their famous formulation that the benefits outweigh the risks, but in other parts of the same appraisal, they said we don't know what the risks are. We don't know what the risks of death are. We know it happens, but we just don't know how. It's obviously not super frequent, but like how frequent, we don't exactly know. We don't exactly know how many skin bridges there are. We don't know exactly how much touch-up surgeries are. Like all that stuff isn't really known. And so then to make a cost benefit analysis is totally anachronistic. And also, there seems to be some controversy around this because they have not re-updated their statement since 20, I think 17. It's been almost 10 years now. And yet it was still being quoted in the Senate hearing, 3 weeks ago. Oh, they still recommend it. They say that the benefits outweigh the risk. Even though if you go to their website, it says in big stamped letters on top, this is expired. This is expired. And the thing is, it's pretty clear when you look into the history of that document and the people who created it, that they were heavily, heavily culturally biased in favor of circumcision. They were putting their thumb on the scales as hard as they fucking could, and then claiming, "Oh no, no, I'm not biased. Yes, I'm Jewish, and yes, I circumcised my son on my dining room table with quote 3,000 years of my ancestors looking over my shoulder. But when I tell you that it's necessary, or that the benefits outweigh the risks, it's not because of my culture or my religion. Those are irrelevant factors. Now I put myself in a position to have enormous sway on this issue, and this is very similar. I think people now have kind of woken up to say W path and be like, yeah, most people don't have inogonophilia. Most people are not uh, trans, but there's a small, small, small number of people who are trans and who do have autogonophilia. And if those people are really, really motivated and they get the proper medical degrees, they can put themselves in a position at, say, WPATH and then just start turning out medical papers where they say, where they confirm their kink, essentially. Their kink, or at least their bias. That's kink is the maybe the least charitable way to look at it, but at the very least, their bias. And suddenly that becomes medical orthodoxy. Now, that doesn't always work. It wouldn't work if you were to, if you were a Nazi and you became, because that goes against the normal biases that most people have. But if you're able to do that and you're able to then match with biases people do have, they will be susceptible to that. So you have so many people who are default gonna support trans, for instance. They're gonna say, look, trans people, we love them, they're the best, they're oppressed. And so when WPATH starts saying, yeah, you need to transition your kids and you need to put them on Lupron and you need to do surgery before they're 12 or whatever, they're that is close enough to their existing biases that they don't argue it nearly as much as they should. And I think circumcision is a larger, older example of a very similar thing, that the handful of physicians who are really pushing hard on this, who are doing these meta-analyses like Brian Morrison, or who are in the Galal Society, which just have a fetish for watching videos of babies getting circumcised, and will talk about it in a way that shows that there's a clear psychological thing going on, imposing their will, changing them, turning them, corrupting them into teen cut or whatever. Like, I'm not saying the average doctor who does circumcision thinks that way or feels that way. That's probably not true. But the ones who do feel that way and have the credentials to do it somehow manage to disproportionately be represented in things like the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force on Circumcision. Not even the American Academy of Pediatrics generally, but on their task force for circumcision. Yeah, they're going to go there because then that's a place where they can then really leverage a small number of people, a small clique, to then make something very, very universal. And this is, I think, why they're pushing so hard against these bans. Again, we're talking about small numbers. There aren't that many who are getting Medicaid. They're not talking about banning it, but if you do this and the rates go down, if you get to the situation where most people are not circumcised, then it becomes much more vulnerable to other kinds of restrictions. And I also, so like, I think that's what's really going on. I think that they really feel like they need to stop it and make these very unreasonable arguments about, it's anti-Semitic, the religion. Um, so yeah, there's one other thing I wanted to look at real quickly here, because I don't want to make a whole video about this. I don't think the audio is going to work. I could not find the original of this. This was posted by Brother K. Brother K is one of the Bloodstained Men, and he posts a lot of content. And I can't say that I watch all of it, but I couldn't figure out where the original was. But this is a YouTube short. Let's see if this works.
In Europe, everyone's against circumcision. In the Latino culture, nobody circumcises their sons. The unfortunate reality in this predominantly Christian part of America is that uncircumcised dudes in middle school, high school, the locker room, even college, they were made fun of. I had to listen to girls in high school and women in college talk about how gross they thought an uncircumcised PP is. So if I can make a decision for my son to have a procedure that he literally slept through and will not remember for the rest of his life, that saves him the embarrassment of being bullied over his genitalia in very crucial developmental years of his life, I'm going to do that. Your son is going to be frustrated with you whenever he makes the seventh grade football team and has to change in front of his peers and he gets bullied over his genitalia, over something that you could have made a decision to prevent. Spare me your facts. I don't want to watch a documentary. I don't care how many circumcisions you've watched on YouTube. Kind of weird. I hope that you anti-circ mommies genuinely put your son's mental health over your own ego. In Europe, every
So I'm not sure, like, if the I don't know if you guys could hear that. Maybe I'll just put the link. So this it's not. I guess I wanted to find the original because I actually want to know where he's really coming from. The implication here is that he's uncircumcised and then got bullied for it, or had to hear girls about it, or at least he heard about it from other people. So it's not entirely clear. I just want to say two things. We don't The age when people are engaging in lots of nudity in the football team or whatever is kind of past. It does happen, but it's way, way, way less common. You heard, good. Okay. Uh, so that's good. So now you know what I'm talking about. Thank you, SH. Ellen, thank you for watching this entire time. You see, you've been online as soon as I started, and you're still there. So great. Um, the So it's not 100% clear, but we're really past the point where that's super common, the whole locker room thing. This is also a very strange argument just in general in terms of uh, a medically necessary. I mean, okay, you might get made fun of because you have a small penis, or that you do or do not have pubic hair, or you have freckles or don't have freckles. For girls, their boobs might not be big or whatever. So again, as these arguments, then we cosmetically, or maybe you have big areolas. I don't know. You don't want to be made fun of for that, do you? So maybe you should have areola reduction surgery. Um, Again, these are the totally non-medical arguments. The other thing too, I think there's a lot of people who are worried about this, but not a lot of people who actually experience this. I've related this story a couple times, but there was a guy in my Boy Scout troop who was uncircumcised, and he was super nervous to shower with us. He just refused for basically a few years, and then when he finally did it, none of us made fun of him, and he loved it, and he said it was great. You could imagine that scenario playing out in a different way, where maybe he would be made fun of, maybe not. But would that be worth not having a foreskin for? I mean, he at that point, and since then, he would have the option to get circumcised if he wants, but he hasn't, as far as I know. He hadn't by then anyway. Um, and it's also interesting. He talks about, oh, you're going to have this developmental problem. The most developmentally plastic time is when you're a neonate, and that's going to be traumatic, and that's going to change. And then you're not going to have the choice later, which, if this guy is a guy who was uncircumcised growing up and he's upset with it, he can decide as an adult to change that. Um, Also, there's just a meta thing. If the problem is the bullying, it's not you. I mean, that's the thing. Like, the problem is the bullying, not you. And also, how common is this? This also is less and less plausible for the reason I said earlier, where the whole locker room culture unity thing has really declined to where it doesn't exist that much anymore. Where it does exist, um, the novelty is not going to be there. Like people who are, say, changing a lot or using communal showers a lot, or on teams where they're taking team showers, which is not the norm anymore, but it still does happen. They're in a situation where they're doing that regularly, and they're going to be used to seeing things. And especially now, because we know that the circumcision rates have gone down enough that the idea that, like, it's just going to be me and I'm going to be the only one is highly, highly unlikely. And someone several years ago, somebody posted in the communal shower subreddit that they had this exact fear, that they were in middle school, they were not on football team, they were in gym class, and they were uncircumcised. And at some point, the school district announced, hey, the teachers have been complaining that the students are unhygienic, that they stink post gym class, and so we're gonna starting, whatever, next week, 2 weeks, it's gonna be required that you shower naked after gym class. Especially if it's not last period. Last period, who cares? Not a big deal. But any other period, it's an issue. And he was just terrified. Oh my God, we're gonna have to get naked, and they're all gonna see that I'm uncircumcised, and they're all gonna make fun of me. And the day comes, and this was in the South. I think he said this was in Louisiana, and half the kids were uncircumcised. And so you have a lot of people who think, and it probably wasn't just him who was afraid. Oh my God! And I met someone at PorkFest years ago who came up to me. I was wearing a pro foreskin shirt, and he said, I want to talk to you about that. And oh, here we go. We're going to have an argument. And he said, when he grew up, he was uncircumcised. His parents they wanted him to have the choice, and so they decided to leave him intact. And growing up, he was terrified that he would be made fun of, that he would be alienated, that he would be ostracized. He literally never was. Nobody even knew. It never came up. But he was so worried about it that he decided to get himself circumcised when he was 13. He started begging his parents when he was a few years even before that, and they had said, "You're too young. You can't make that decision yet." But their whole logic for having him not be cut was to give him that choice. And so when he's old enough to start arguing that, they were in a position to kind of have to respect it. And so when he was 13, they finally relented and said, fine, you can get circumcised. And he got circumcised. And he was telling me now, and he's in his, I think, late 20s at this point when he's telling me this story, he's like, it was by far the worst decision he ever made. He said that it reduced his sensitivity almost completely, like 100%. It went from like, even though his sexual experiences as a 13-year-old were probably quite limited, um, the sensitivity went to basically nothing. And the thing is, when you talk to people who have been circumcised after some degree of sexual maturity, I think I didn't ask him, but he probably was still a virgin when that happened, but that doesn't mean he hadn't, experienced masturbate. But when you talk to people who have, you do get mixed things. You have people who will say, oh, it wasn't a huge deal. I do feel like there's a bias because people are deciding to be hypnotized, not hypnotized, trying to be deciding to be circumcised, uh, have a buy-in. You're deciding to do it, and so then suddenly you're culpable. There's a psychological incentive to do it. There's also a honeymoon period where like the sensitivity of your gland is not going to disappear on day one or day three or day five. In fact, because it's no longer covered, it's going to feel extra sensitive for a while. But then after a few months, a few years, it's going to decline and decline and decline. And really, I think a satisfying window would be you'd want to be surveying people like 4 or 5, 6 years later, and there really aren't any surveys to do that. But there's plenty of others who say it's the worst decision I ever made, and that side of the argument makes a lot more sense just uh, because of the physicality of what's happening. So this idea though, the trauma isn't in the physics. The trauma is in the perception that you're going to be bullied. Was this guy actually bullied? Did he actually get made fun of? Again, I'm sure it does happen, but there's a lot of people who have it in their head that they're going to get bullied and they worry about stuff. I was never bullied, and I'm not uncircumcised. I wasn't worried about that, but like, I wasn't facing systematic bullying from anyone, but I still worried about it. It's still something that, oh, am I going to get bullied when I go to middle school? Am I going to get bullied when I go to high school? Am I going to get bullied in the showers? I did worry about that. Um, and in my case, I actually never really was. Some people are. But then the problem is the bullying. The problem isn't you, or the problem isn't your uncircumcised penis. That's not the problem. And it's also just out of date at this point because it's too common now you're not going to be the only one. There's even places where being cut is going to be the minority position. And I've heard of that. I had a friend from a city in Maine who said on his football team it was two-thirds uncircumcised, one-third circumcised, and the uncircumcised guys in the majority made fun of the minority circumcised guys. I also had a friend from the UK who had been circumcised for phimosis when he was 8, and then he went to a boarding school, as they do in England, and they did take showers together, and he was absolutely terrified and begged to be allowed to wear a swimsuit because he was the only circumcised guy there. And they refused, and so he did it after shower, and he never actually got made fun of. Nobody actually said anything negative, but he was so sensitive about it that he just it it like well he started to feel incredibly inferior for reasons that are like kind of logical, but also just psychological as well because like I'm the one who doesn't fit in. But they never actually said anything. I mean, I asked them, did anyone actually make fun of you? And the answer was no. So that's how you, if the issue is your internal fears and your internal angst and your phobias and your and I would say in many cases irrational fears, the answer to that is not to surgically validate your fears. This is kind of like where the trans people have gotten so wrong and so much is, and maybe to a way bigger degree, is like if you have this belief that you're in the wrong body, the first thing you do is not turn to surgery. Maybe at some point, many years down the road, you go there uh, and uh, maybe then and only then. But you don't do it to a newborn saying, "Oh, we're going to forestall that ever happening." And again, this is so. What if you decide to move? What is he going to say when they come back to him later? I'm like, I actually want my foreskin. I that wasn't a decision you should have made. And he's going to say, "Oh, well, you could have gotten made fun of." I mean, that's such a strange hypothetical. You could add so many different things. But this is the level of the argument where we're at in terms of the argumentation. There really isn't a good argument that stands up to any scrutiny, and you have to switch principles. This is why the whole religious thing doesn't really work because you say, oh, yeah, it's because of religious freedom. Okay, so what about female circumcision for Muslims? Oh, no, 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 no. What about foot binding? What about whatever other religious, the facial scarring or tattooing of infants? Those are things that can happen. There's cultures that do that. I remember seeing, I think it's the Hazda, but most of the adults, they're covered in these little scars on their face, and they're from when they're babies. If their families don't want to hear them cry, they'll scar their face because when the wound before it scarifies, when the wound is still open, it hurts to cry, and so they won't cry, right? Because if your face has a cut in it, it hurts to cry, and so they stop, and then they grow up and they have all these little things. You're like, oh, that's just part of their culture. It's wonderful. Like, no, 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 that's just straight up child abuse, and you can't do that. Even though I would rather have scars on my face than have my prepuce completely removed. So let me look at some of these messages. I've been watching your channel since 2011. Well, thank you, Varsity Athlete. If you've been watching it that long and your name is Varsity Athlete, you're probably not a varsity athlete anymore. Um, I wish I'd never discovered circumcision debate because it's given me FOMO as a cut guy. Yeah, so this is actually I think one of the only kind of valid critiques of intactivism, I actually think, because there are a class of people who are blissfully ignorant, right? They don't if you I mean I all circumcision is bad. Even the most professionally done, best done circumcision is bad. Um, there's some that are so bad that I mean, where if you just have excruciating pain, bleeding, there's people whose scars are like at their base. I mean, it's and that you start getting weird things with hair growth, like curve, all that stuff. But like, and people who have those types of circumcisions, I mean, they're eventually going to figure it out almost certainly and be like, this really, really fucked me up. If you have a standard circumcision where you don't have the most extreme negative things, I mean, in a way, the most extreme negative thing is the prepuce being gone. But in addition to that, let's say, um, but let's say you can still orgasm and you still have sexual pleasure, and indeed, most cut guys still do have sexual pleasure. It's not the same as it would be. I would argue it's probably significantly less, although, like I said, I think there are bell curves here. I mean, I know people who are uncircumcised, but their natural foreskin is so incredibly short that they might as well be circumcised. I mean, like they literally have zero coverage at any point when they're fully flaccid. Like if you look at them at any point of arousal or lack of arousal, you can't tell. And if you look at somebody like that, like what, they're not getting. most of the benefits of but uh, and there's people who are circumcised incredibly minimally, where they do like the old school Jewish one, the mepitza bepet, the original, just the acropostion, just the overhang, not the full denuding of the prepuce. That's still not good. You don't want that. That is a diminution. That's sexually reductive, but it is much more minor than full removal of the prepuce, which is now kind of the standard typical way. I have met people like that though who had that. Um, and so yeah, if you're in a position though where you still are having sexual pleasure, being told that actually you're probably only feeling a fraction of it, I would say my best guess is on average it's like a 90% reduction. Like again, it varies a lot, but I actually think that is probably about correct. In terms of all the tissue that's gone is gone. So there's feeling in all that tissue that's gone, and then what's remained will lose a lot of its sensitivity. So you're not going to lose your glands typically. And I love the people who like it's not missing anything. Yeah, if you cut your glands off, you could probably still have kids, but that doesn't mean that cutting your glands off is irrelevant or not a big deal. Um, so yeah, but then you are in this position of, like you said, FOMO, where you're like, oh, I'm missing all this, and that can really bother some people. It's really bothered me, to be perfectly honest. And then there's a question of should you then should you be allowed to live in blissful ignorance, and unfortunately, you don't know until you don't know, you can't weigh the options, right? Like, let's say you've never heard of it, and I come up to you and I'm like, I'm not going to tell you what, but there's something out there. Like, there may have been something bad done to you, but I don't want to. Do you want me to tell you or not? And if you don't know how you're going to feel after, you just have no way to assess it. Now, you might be able to know in hindsight, like, really, I didn't need to know that, you know. I mean, I kind of look at it like kind of like if you found out when you were 25 that actually you had a great aunt who had willed you, a couple $1 million, uh, and your family just stole it, and they never told you about it. Like they raised you like normal, like they didn't mistreat you necessarily, but that you had this inheritance that they squandered on themselves or got rid of or whatever, and you didn't know about it because you wouldn't know as a newborn. You wouldn't know that your aunt Gloris had put you in her will or whatever. And now as an adult, you can't get the money back. It's gone. It's there. It doesn't exist. Your statute of limitations, whatever. Do you need to know? Do you want to know about the inheritance? And I think people are going to have different answers, and it's real tricky. But I will just say, like, the truth. At some point, you kind of default to like, what's the truth? And the other thing too is like, I want this to stop, and the only way to make it stop is to talk about it and to persuade people not to do it. And that does mean there's a risk that some people who are blissfully ignorant are going to be exposed to something that is upsetting to them. But it's still the truth. And it's also something you can cope with. I do recommend that people who feel that way do consider foreskin restoration. It's not perfect. It is time consuming. It's not going to make it as good as new or but it'll help physically to a large extent, and it will help emotionally to a large extent, or just talk about it, whatever, get active. But I don't think it makes sense to say let's not have there be any discussion about true issues and um, actually look at the practice and say, because some people, and maybe not a small number of people, are going to get upset, because I think that's right. Absolutely, some people will. Um, I got snipped at 14 after 5 years of medical attempts to get it to pull back. I wonder if it was what I know. That is premature. If it's unless you're having issues. Now, if you can't retract and you're having constant pain, constant irritation, if you're getting lots of infections, like I have talked to uncircumcised guys who say that, when they were a little kid, it was no problem, and then they started to go through puberty, and as soon as they start to go through puberty, they start to they're producing more oils and more their sebaceous gland. You start to become dirtier, basically. And this is why they have always had locker rooms for middle school and high school kids, but usually not for elementary school kids because, yeah, an elementary school kid can get muddy and dirty, but like they don't sweat. I mean, they sweat too, but like they just don't stink as much. Your body is just not as pher pheromonially active. And this guy was telling me that once he started to go through puberty, then he started to get more hygiene needs, but then his foreskin started to get sore. He started to get what turned out to be like he would get infections, very minor infections. These weren't like life-threatening, but it would become painful. And in his case, he didn't have phimosis. He just had to start cleaning it. He just had to start retracting in the showers. It didn't add any time to his shower time. It was very easy for him to do. And as soon as he started doing that, the problems went away. And I've heard that many times. Guys, like they're growing up, they don't have to really do anything hygiene-wise because it just kind of takes care of itself. And then there gets to be a point when you're dirtier, when you're older, when you're going through puberty, where now you have to start paying more attention to it. But like I said, I've also known guys who are full adults. They've gone through puberty. They have phimosis, 100%. I mean, several guys, zero, never seen their heads, like even a little bit, some of them. And they're fine. They never have soreness. They never have problems having sex. Sometimes because they're bottoms, sometimes just it's fine the way that it is. And they've never, I mean, the hygiene is not an issue for them. Um, and if that was the case for you, if you were not having um, secondary issues, I would say, like soreness, pain, infections, um, nasty smells that were uncontrollable or whatever, then I would say that it's not urgent. It is something that can wait. It could have probably waited. Different story. If you can't retract and you are having those problems, then yeah, it's more urgent. You need to find a way to be able to retract. And if you can't, then maybe circumcision might be justified in those cases. Um, Typically, there's ways around it. There's graduated discs. There's a company called Phymocure, so you can just get like a whatever disc, however big you are, however big your opening is, and as long as it's not fused shut, like Neon at the start of the Matrix, where his mouth fuses shut, like you can get something in there, and then you get a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one, and just like the lip discs and the earlobe discs that you see in East Africa, you see how big those get, right? You're only going to have to open it like an inch and it's going to be big enough, right? Maybe less. Um, there's manual techniques you can do. I've helped several guys with manual techniques. Where I just explain this is what you need to do, and typically they're easy, they're typically fun, and they work usually in a couple weeks, sometimes a couple months. There's also surgeries you can do that are less invasive than circumcision. But it's kind of a question of how urgent are you talking. If there's no urgency, then 14 is way too early. You wouldn't really be able to diagnose phimosis until you were like 18, really. If it still was not retracting at that point and you were having problems, then yeah, you maybe go and seek some kind of surgical intervention at that point, but not before that point, really. Um, but who knows? And you also could say that like, do you know if you can't retract at 14, do you know you're going to be able to retract at 16? Or like I can understand too psychologically if you get it into your, and I've seen posts of like this on Reddit where guys are fine, they have no problems, they feel there's no pain, and then they discover phimosis, and then they discover that they have phimosis, and suddenly now they're freaking out and they're having all kinds of oh my God, I thought I was normal and now I think that I'm not. And this might be a 14, 15, 16-year-old, kid, for lack of a better term, who's now freaking out even though they have no actual issues, like physical, medical issues, but now they have a psychological issue because they're being told phimosis is this horrible thing. Phimosis is not a horrible thing. Sometimes it bothers people and they want to get it remedied, and there's remedies that you can apply and get. In those cases, it is not oh, you just found out you have. I mean, people act like they just found out they have HIV, and that is not what it's like. Um, yeah. So let's see. The movie Europa Europa by Angelika Holland is about a Jewish teenager who pretends to be a German orphan in World War II when he sees the Germans pull down a Jewish man's pants and kill him on the spot. Okay, maybe that's the movie he saw. Okay, I've never seen that movie. Um, there's every chance that did happen at least sometimes. But man, it's a good they didn't invade the U.S. because like half, I think 1920 was the year when the circumcision rate in the U.S. kind of for newborns passed a half, 50%, which means in the 1940s, all the teenagers that like half of them would have been circumcised. Um, I was having issues, yeah, pain, urinating, etc., and years of steroid creams, etc., didn't work, so I'm not too torn up about it. I don't think that steroid. So one thing, it is possible to have an opening that's not only too small but inelastic. There are things that can happen sometimes from forced retraction. Actually, this is another kind of thing, but like where if you develop scar tissue on the opening and it loses its elasticity, then you may have you are then in a position where normal stretching techniques may not be effective, right? If there's no give in the tissue, there's no give in the tissue, and if it's only 3 millimeters opening and it's not going to get any bigger, then there probably is a surgical path that makes sense. Not necessarily circumcision. There's slits there's things you can do to open it that are less invasive. I forget their terms, but they exist. Um, or do a circumcision, but at least then also you could do like, well, hey, just take just a little bit or however much you want, right? Like you're getting older at that point. I would say if you are having pain, then yeah, then it is more urgent, and it's like don't wait till you're 18 at that point. Um, but did you use stretching techniques? Did you use, you know, um, devices like Thymocure? Um, Again, I think it depends where you live. I don't know where you lived, but like there's so just the culture generally, but specifically the medical culture is so biased in favor of circumcision and so biased against foreskin that it's it's very often that you will get just really terrible and anachronistic advice on this topic. Um, I mean, like I said, I have friends. I mean, right now, 2025, who when they go to see their physician for regular checkups, are just straight up told you need to get circumcised, even though they've told them for years they don't want to be circumcised and they have no problem. And there's all kinds of anecdotes to that effect. I remember reading one where a guy said, he would go to a gym and there was a guy who went to the gym, an older man who was a doctor, and he was changing, and the guy was watching him change, and he just said, you should get circumcised. Not because he said, oh, it looks like you have balanitis, or it looks like you have phimosis, or it looks like, whatever. It was just like, I just want to cut that foreskin off. It needs to be gone. I don't want to see it. Um, Freud can have a field day. Or it could just be that they believe that's what the medical, literature says they should do, and so that's what they do. Um, yeah, this was nearly 20 years ago in the UK. Never heard of any devices. At least it was free on the NHS. Well, yeah, so the NHS kind of has an interesting history with this because it was the NHS in 1948 that kind of put the nix on medical circumcision. People have this impression that Americans circumcise and British people don't, and that's not really true. There was a history of circumcision in the UK. A lot of the first physicians who promoted circumcision as a medical prophylactic were English, um, and Americans kind of picked it up from them to a very large extent. And but in the UK, the rates were never that high. So, like I said, in the United States, they slowly grew, and by 1920, it was half of newborns were getting circumcised, and I think by the 40s or 50s it was like in the 80, 90%. Some people say 99, like a very high percentage. Uh, and in the UK, it never got that high. They think it maybe peaked at around 30%, maybe. There's debate about this. Um, eh, um, uh, there were surveys done. I mean, we don't know, but like the Royal Air Force did survey their airmen at one point, or their staff. They're not all airmen, obviously, and I think in the 50s, and it was like a 30%. But they also admitted, the average person doesn't become an Air Force person. But when the NHS was established, they decided we need to just determine whether this is medically necessary or not, because we need to determine if it's covered. And speaking specifically of RIC, routine infant circumcision. The other thing that was different in the UK than the US is it was usually not done to infants. It was usually done when like early adolescence or late childhood. Uh, and there's something psychologically different when you do it that way, because if you do it to a neonate, then unless somebody tells them, they're never going to know. And they're less likely to miss it. If you do it to somebody who's going to remember, then they might end up being okay. They might end up really missing it. And I have met people like that. There are stories, famously John Maynard Keynes, of all people. We actually know quite a bit about his case because he had a brother who talked about it at length. John Maynard Keynes um, was a serial masturbator as a kid, and they were trying to, I mean, what they would have called that, who know, like, I'm sure it was not so bad, but they did things like sew his pocket shuts. He used to put his hands in his pockets. It's crazy that we know this much because again, his brother talked about it. You can find audio of it. Would put his hands in his pockets and he would masturbate, and they would show his pocket shuts. And eventually, they decided when he was, I want to say like 10-ish, give or take a year or two, they circumcised him, and they did it without anesthetic. And the whole point was to basically punish him and teach him the penis is not for pleasure, it's for pain. And that, I mean, just imagine that. That's so fucked up to do that to somebody. But that was the way they did it. But then what would happen is even if you had 20%, 15% of people circumcised, if they're getting circumcised like that, man, they're probably not gonna, they're much more likely to not really be in favor of it because they're gonna be like, yeah, that was fucked up, and I'm not gonna do that to my kid. And so Um, the NHS commissioned a physician named Gardner to look into it, and he issued what was called the Gardner Report. And he basically said, "Look, there's no benefit. It doesn't really protect against any of the diseases people says it can. Like it doesn't protect you from chlamydia. It doesn't protect you from syphilis. It doesn't protect you from gonorrhea. It doesn't protect you from penile cancer." He did say, obviously, if you have phimosis, you should be circumcised, but the majority, 98% of boys do not have phimosis. And so he said that it should not be recommended. And so when the NHS said fine, and it became they would not do routine infant circumcision without an indication of an actual. And Gardner got a lot wrong too, because he did believe in congenital phimosis. He did believe, hey, if you can't retract the foreskin for somebody, for a baby, then that's a problem, and you should forcibly retract. And forcible retraction is not a good idea. In fact, that can cause actual phimosis. And I actually know someone who was, I mean, terribly traumatized by being forcibly retracted when he was 5, where his mom was like, the doctor said you have to get retracted, and she put him in the bathtub and like, I mean, just yanked his skin back until it tore off, and he said it was the most intense, incredible pain he's ever felt. It was bleeding, he was screaming, and he was traumatized forever. And of course, when I met him in his 20s, he was a total bottom, and he did not even like his dick being touched. And I even asked him, "Do you think that's because of that?" He goes, "Well, I don't know, but like it would make total sense if that was related." I mean, he had that memory. He goes, "It's my earliest memory and my worst memory." And so Gardner is kind of a mixed figure here because he was saying, "Hey, if you can't retract a 1-year-old, you should forcibly retract," and that's terrible advice. There also were this led to some really, really bad UTI studies because they would say, okay, we're going to study if circumcision helps with UTIs, and we have cohort A, cohort B. Cohort A is circumcised, cohort B is uncircumcised. we're going to test their rates of UTIs, but they told the parents of the uncircumcised babies, you need to, for hygienic reasons, you need to forcibly retract them, which is not only painful, but also causes all kinds of tissue damage and tears, micro tears, not so micro tears, and those all raise the risk of infections. And if you are repeatedly doing that, that will repeatedly happen. And so when they did the study, sure enough, there was a higher case of UTIs among um, these uncircumcised babies, but this could almost entirely be accounted for by this practice. So like, yeah, Gardner's quite a mixed bag when it comes to this. Um, Parkfest 2020, I take a communal shower with Ross Ulbricht. He's got more experience than most. Well, assuming he wasn't in solitary confinement. Yeah. If he goes, that'll be awesome. He can have a free one. Um, Nevergoon Rothbard. What does that mean? Rothbard, so it's interesting, Rothbard, he said that, NAP, non-aggression principle, but he also said that there should be everyone is allowed one exception, right? It's almost like he understood that everyone's going to have one thing that they just think, hey, the state should do this one thing. So, if you're Walter Block, the one thing the state should do is genocide the Palestinians, right? Right. It shouldn't regulate floral licenses. It shouldn't, you know, I don't know, tax lobsters, but it should genocide Palestinians. And at Porkfest, I remember a Jewish guy telling me, "I'm not going to even argue with you, but Rothbard said you get um, one exception, and my exception is circumcision." So he's admitting I think it's a rights violation, and I can't even defend it, and I'm not going to. I'm just going to say I really, really favor it. That's quite interesting. It's hard to it's impossible not to conclude in that situation that it's not a philosophical argument at that point. He's just emotionally feels that way. And why is that? Who knows? Could be religious, and he was Jewish, so could be religious or cultural religious, right? So it's funny. So how many Jews don't believe in God? I was also heard that interesting today that like you can go to any synagogue and question if God is real. That's no problem. Say God's not real. I don't believe in God. No biggie. No biggie. You're welcome. But if you say it's real, it's not doing good. That's going too far. So it's interesting where the lines get drawn nowadays. Um, it's definitely not the norm in the UK. No, not anymore. So after the Gardner report was issued, the NHS stopped covering it for routine infant circumcision, and the rates went way down. And I think now they think the rates are something like 10%. You do have a lot of Muslims and a lot of Jews in Israel. I'm sorry, in England, and people still get it done. I mean, I've been to England and I met circumcised guys there who weren't Jewish. It's just not very common. Um, Back in the day, Milton Friedman was kicked out of a hardcore libertarian gathering for supporting World War II. Yeah, there's a famous thing where Mises was at the Mount Pelerin Society and he told um, Friedman that they're all just a bunch of socialists, and it was kind of a joke that like who could consider Friedman a socialist? But yeah, I mean Mises could. Mises Friedman gave us the income. I looked at Milton Friedman, great on net. I mean he's great, but he's not the best. um, Happy we didn't change our position on a war. Conklin was there when this happened. Oh, interesting. This is a different story then, because I don't think Conklin would have been at the Mount Pelerin Society because that was in like 1946. Um, yeah, Friedman's interesting because I actually think if you compare what he wanted, what he advocated for, especially towards the end, it's quite radical compared to what we have. Uh, he's super radical compared to what how it exists now and even how it existed then. Uh, but because he was so famous, I don't think they could marginalize him as just being like, oh, you're just a kook. But they did try and paint that like, oh, well, there's even more radical people than him, like these Mises people, um, and to marginalize them as a result. I also one of those. It's kind of interesting how history has been because he won a Nobel Prize. He became extremely famous. He probably is. He's in the top three economists of the 20th century in terms of his fame and his influence. He might be number one. Yeah, it's debatable. You get Keynes, obviously, maybe Hayek. There's others too. I mean, there's some big names. Uh, as a someone as a Rothbardian, as someone who's been influenced by the Austrian school, there's a sense of like, why is this guy so great compared to Rothbard? But in their deaths, in their legacies, it is interesting because I feel like intellectually speaking, in terms of movements, Rothbard has been way more influential. I mean, he's just shaped so many more people for a very long time now. And David Friedman has kind of, I don't know, lamented this. It's very ironic because David Friedman looks like Murray Rothbard. Everyone, it's a joke, but it's totally true. Um, and he laments that like, there isn't a Milton Friedman Institute that's just out there pumping out his stuff all the time, or there is a Mises Institute, which just you got to hand it to Lou Rockwell, man. He told Margareta von Mises he wanted her blessing, her endorsement of the Mises Institute, and she would only give it on the condition that he would swear that he would dedicate his life to the propagation of his ideology and his economics. And he said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And he has totally lived up to that promise. And that institute has just done a great job of, I mean, through the Mises University, but also just through all the lectures and all the videos and all the publishing that they've done. That now Rothbard has had this growing second life, this that kind of Friedman hasn't had, like to the same degree. And David Friedman seems a little salty about it, maybe deservedly so, right? There's things about Rothbard. I mean, I've found it's been years since I've read any of him, but I read a lot of his works early on, and I thought he was a phenomenal writer and a phenomenal thinker. And you just read that stuff, and you're like, who are these other people who are getting all these accolades when he's clearly like, and maybe that's not fair because like how many of those other people was I reading? That's a fair point. Like, but the idea that this guy couldn't even get a professorship is just asinine. Um, and I think there was some bitterness there, but I also think Murray could be apparently quite petty, and he had his own foibles. He had like a phobia about leaving Manhattan. Um, so he didn't leave Manhattan for like decades because he was afraid to leave Manhattan, which is strange. I guess that's the thing some New Yorkers have. Yeah. So, all right, guys. Any final questions? What does SH stand for? Is that a Rothbard picture? I've never heard what Rothbard said about circumcision. Have a good week. Thanks. Don't regret your circumcision too much. Sounds like maybe it was you had one of the more justifiable ones. Oh, well, there you go. Good week. I'll probably upload again next week about Pork Fest, probably. We'll see. Yeah, it's kind of hard to know for sure. My tendency is that it's overprescribed so much to be like, no, just hold up, because I mean, we have again, but that doesn't mean that it's never a plausible option. It's usually not the best option, right? So the fact that you never try to use, any of the devices, you know, that's not, I feel like that's jumping too fast to go to surgery. You don't just go to surgery if there's a non-surgical answer that's the non-pharmacological, right? You're not talking about drugs. You're just talking about, jewelry essentially. Tell us if you see Ross out at Porkfest. I hope he goes. I'm not the hugest, Ross Ulbricht. I never made a video, I don't think, ever about him. Um, I because his mom was always at PorcFest, he's kind of got a celebrity status there. But he certainly doesn't owe me anything. So like I wouldn't count on it. And I would be curious what he thought about communal showers. He's probably had quite a few now. Who knows? I mean, he might have been in solitary confinement. Did they put him in the Supermax? And I don't know that he's going to go. I kind of think he is, but I don't know. Um, he definitely would be well received, that's for sure. I mean, I think Ron Paul should go. I don't know why he still hasn't done it. Like, he's getting kind of old now, but like, man, talk about rock star status. That guy. I wonder how Ron Paul feels about circumcision. Is there a Ron Paul circumcision? It's a baby doctor after all. Ron Paul on circumcision. What's Ron Paul's position on circumcision? And nobody knows. Who gives a shit? That's his position. We're 15 trillion in debt. This is 13 years ago. It's even worse. Yeah, it doesn't look like he's ever talked about it. And if you look it up, I mean, then you start getting all these Peter Paul and the circumcision controversies. You're talking about New Testament debates about it. Yeah, I don't know. Um, he was an OBGYN, so he might have done hundreds of them. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, and for his age, he would have been. I mean, who knows? Who knows? He's also he's also very philosophical. So like, who knows? But the circumcision debate will kind of among libertarians especially. It's gonna fall into debates about what are the rights of children relative to their parents, and that's just a very debatable place, and people just disagree with that on that in so many ways. Like there are people who make the argument and not, that parents just have the right to do stuff like that. And traditionally, our society has said, yeah, I mean, most societies say that you do. So like, you know, I don't know that he would differ from that. It's not. I feel like when I first started, I mean, someone said they've been watching me since. Oh, I have a splinter. Someone was saying that they've been watching me for 11 years. 11 years ago, I feel like it either wasn't an issue or most libertarians would just say, "Oh, the parent should have the right to do that." I think that that's changed a lot, where it's become way more acceptable to question it in libertarian circles, and I don't know what the numbers are. When I talk about it at PorcFest, and I'm doing PorcFest for the communal showers, but I do sometimes do some side into activism. Generally, the response is very positive. Um, People don't have it as like an issue that it's like their top issue or anything. Or maybe they don't even feel strong. Whatever stance they have, they may not hold really strongly. But typically, yeah, they get it, and obviously, like a Medicaid question, that's an easy one. There, it should not be covered by Medicaid. That's a turn it back to the original title of the video. So, all right, any other questions? I don't know, how did I get a hang? Going once, going twice, three times, and sold. All right, thank you guys. And I guess I'll talk to you the next time they actually do pass a ban on Medicaid circumcision in New Hampshire, hopefully sooner than later. But until then, I'll talk to you all another day.